Hello, it's Amy. I'm back again reading from the Journal of Emily Shore. This is the diary of a young woman living in the 1830s in England, and now we've reached the part of the journal where her family has relocated to Portugal for her health. And so we are beginning with the entry for February the 16th, 1839. I rode on the St. Gonzalo Road for an hour. It was a brilliant, fresh, calm morning, and I never saw the sea so beautifully clear and transparent from cliffs 600 or 700 feet in height. I could see quite distinctly every stone and pebble beneath the water, through which they gleamed like massive emeralds. The rocks here are everywhere clustered richly with prickly pear, geraniums, myrtles, and fig trees, almost covered with a tender green mantle. There was a delicious stillness in the air. I heard no sound except when we occasionally met a peasant, or passed a little hut under the rough stony hills. The thermometer in the shade is now 68 degrees Fahrenheit. No rain nor indication of rain. The early crops have failed, and the seconds are likely to be ruined too. Well, our people were gone out making calls, for these are not yet finished. Mr. Freeman came and told me that they proposed making use of this afternoon, if we liked it, to take as many of us as liked to go to see Palmyra. This had been talked of before, Miss Freeman having obtained permission from Lord and Lady Elibank, by whom it is inhabited. Accordingly, at 3:30 in the afternoon, both the Freemans came, and Papa and Mamma, Arabella and Louisa, set off with them. I longed to be able to go too. They partly rode, partly walked, Miss Freeman lending her horse and using it by turns. Papa came home so delighted with Miss Freeman that he said nothing about the Palmyra. "Emily," he said, "I think she is a very personification of innocence. Her eyes are benignity itself, and the way in which she thanks her brother and sister, or rather thanks her brother, smiles upon him when he does anything for her, is quite beautiful." By the by, the party went to the Palmyra, returned full of the praises of Lady Elibank, who they say is a most sweet creature and very beautiful. They also took a great fancy to Miss Murray, half-sister of Lord Elibank, and I have heard the Elibanks called very proud, but no traces of pride appear today. They say Lady Elibank does not appear above 18 or 19 years of age. February 17, Sunday. There are few parts of my life on which I look back with more sorrow and self-reproach than my life in Devonshire. I can see how I gradually changed for the worse during that period. I was led astray by flattery and vanity, by uncontrolled feelings, and most of all by a first acquaintance with the everyday follies of the world, and a constant collision with those follies, both in words and actions. Would that I had never been awakened from the happy dream of ignorance in which I lived at 16. Would that I had never learnt how different the world is from all what I had imagined it. I was admired and flattered, in all sincerity, however, to an inordinate degree, and my vanity fed by every sort of incense. I found myself a sort of lioness amongst the whole circle of their acquaintance. I was considered a wonder, a prodigy of talents, goodness, etc. It was in this light the Warrens first heard of me. All this awoke in me a new desire of admiration, which I had never had before. The consciousness of obtaining it only increased this desire, which I am sure must have at last betrayed itself. The consequence of all this was that after my 10 months' absence from home, I returned a different creature. I had become initiated into a new set of ideas. I was spoilt. The load of remorse I had laid up for myself during those 10 months had burdened me ever since, and its weight seems rather to increase now than diminish as time goes by. And we have a note here. The whole of her journal during these 10 months and afterwards shows how imaginary, at any rate, how slight and temporary was this deterioration, believed in by her sensitive conscience. No one else discovered it. And I was about to question myself, what is she talking about here? She didn't really change all that much in Devonshire. She matured a little, and I think we see that in her entries, but I don't think she became, conceited and full of herself, as she seems to imply here. She very much remained her humble and kind self. I really almost begin to think I am making some progress towards health, and may perhaps at last recover. I have felt uncommonly well and strong during the last warm 10 days, and my cough is wonderfully diminished. I certainly receive very great benefit from my frequent rides. February 18, Monday. I finished the first volume of Os Votos Temerarios, and really became interested in it. The history of Lady Clarendon is actually touching. I can read it now by the eye as one does English, faster than one can read aloud, only stopping occasionally at some new word. So I'm going to guess that is some sort of work, probably in Portuguese. February 20th, Wednesday. I rode up the hill above Holloway's boarding house, which is the Great North Road, the one leading to St. Anne's. It is extremely steep, and the view from it is very noble. From these heights, Funchal has almost the appearance of a deserted, uninhabited city. You see no smoke, no moving object, and the bay too so clear and waveless without tide or ripple, the vessels sleeping on their shadows. There is nothing to indicate life, all is quiet and solitude. I rode as far up as a sweet little quinta belonging to some Portuguese, the garden so studded with flowers that I quite coveted it. February 25th, Monday. We had, as usual, a round of visitors. Mr. Hinton led the way soon after breakfast. He has a handsome face, but an uncommonly reserved, illegible expression of countenance, unusually so in such a young man. March 3rd, Sunday. After church, Papa and I took a turn in the church garden with the Freemans. It was one of the most serene, delicious evenings I have known, and the air was sweet with flowers. The narrow walk up to the church is shaded with 2 beautiful cedars. There was something quite soothing in the calmness of the air, broken only by the plash of a little stream and the tinkling note of the goldfinch. The tall datura, covered with its trumpet-like blossoms, now half faded, the gigantic growth of geraniums, the scarlet salvias, and the huge convent that towers high above all tell that we are not in England. Papa, Louisa, and Mackworth went to Dr. Nichols and saw the procession, and entered also into the Socorro Church, where a sermon was preached in Portuguese. This procession is called the Procession of Stations. I passed one of these stations where images were dressed up and tapers lighted. Papa saw only one penitent. They used to be very numerous on these occasions. They are Portuguese gentlemen, and being condemned by their confessor to various penances, perform them in masks and coarse black dresses, that they may not be known. They walk barefoot over the sharp stones, some carrying heavy images, some with their hands tied to immense bars of iron laid across the back of the neck, some wearing tippets stuck full of nails that point inward. These exhibitions are much disapproved by the Vicar General, who seems to be a sensible liberal man. March 4th, Monday. I found both Mr. and Miss Freeman at home. After her brother had gone out, she said that yesterday she felt most melancholy at the thought of leaving him, quite ready to sink under it. But she has made up her mind to it, and feels that she is more wanted at home. I asked her afterwards whether she liked Madeira. She said, yes, but still I feel I am not at home. It makes a great difference after being a large party at home to be alone here and always anxious as I am. But I ought to like Madeira, for I have learnt a great deal by being here. I am very anxious by nature, and formerly, when I was in trouble, I used quite to sink down under it. And here there is nothing to be done but to trust in God, i.e., when her family at home are ill. And the affection which there would expand itself in sitting by a bedside and other useless little attentions is now spent in prayer, and I have learnt the peace and comfort to be obtained from prayer. I so often wish I could suffer all for others. It is so much easier to suffer sorrows oneself than to see others suffer. One cannot so easily see why another should be afflicted, but when we are afflicted ourselves, we can look into our hearts and see the reason there. She spoke very feelingly about the difficulty of ruling and disciplining our affections, of not loving too fondly, of loving in short, and yet being able to resign those we love when taken from us. She read to me several of the Olney hymns, of which she is very fond, and one in particular, which she had marked in the year 1830. It was a very happy day, she said, when I marked that. There was a pretty little church where we lived then, in a lovely scenery. A hill near it was covered with wood, and I sat there one Sunday between services with my eldest sister, and marked that hymn. I had at that time a sort of shrinking from life. Do you know that feeling? I was so happy without a single care or grief that I could not understand what was meant by the trials and miseries of life. I thought, is this life which I have heard is so full of trouble? I thought it could not last, that sorrows and afflictions must come at length, and I quite dreaded their coming. For I thought I could never support them, and 3 years after sorrow did come. And we'll leave it at that for today, as we are at the 11-minute mark. We will return for the next reading of March 5th, 1839.